Imagine that you asked someone what their opinion on a specific political issue was. Let's say it was on the topic of welfare for the unemployed. If the answer you received was that they would support whatever the democratically elected representatives supported, then you would be a little more informed about their general position, but you would also rightfully feel as if your question was dodged. They only informed you of their position in the libertarian spectrum, which is defined by the question of whose consent and support matters and how disagreements are settled. Some other examples of similar cop-outs include leaving it up to the states to decide and whatever the free market dictates. The spectrum is commonly expressed as one dimension of thought, from authoritarian to libertarian, but this is an oversimplification that encourages people to stop thinking. It also results in both right libertarians and left libertarians calling the other side oxymoronic and paradoxical. While we would normally associate cop-outs with simply stating where your position lies on the libertarian spectrum, significantly less of us would associate cop-outs with simply stating your position without where it lies in the libertarian spectrum. I argue this phenomenon is merely a matter of the context in which the current political arguments are held. For example, if you ask someone if they thought people should go to reform centers when it is discovered that they have a drug problem, and they answered yes, then you would likely assume they meant by force. However, they didn't actually specify what they thought on the issue of force in that context. Whatever the reason that this is currently viewed this way, it is clear that it could be very misleading. It is worth noting that even if the issue of disagreement lies on the libertarian spectrum, one can still dodge the question while still giving a position related to the issue on the libertarian spectrum. For example, if you asked someone if they thought gay people should be allowed to get married, and they replied by saying they wanted the states to decide, what they're actually doing is telling you where their position lies on the meta-libertarian spectrum. The meta-libertarian spectrum being defined by the question of whose consent and support matters for deciding whose consent and support matters. Following this concept to its logical conclusion allows for a potentially infinite amount of meta-libertarian spectrums that a position lies on, because each higher-level spectrum would need to be decided itself. An interesting consequence of the existence of an infinite amount of libertarian spectrums is that there would be both an infinite amount of ways to dodge a question and an infinite amount of questions which would need to be answered. Fortunately, in all practicality, people either argue for a finite amount of these spectrums, with an authoritarian one at the top, or they argue for a systematically anti-authoritarian infinity that is cyclical. Earlier on in this video, I mentioned that the libertarian spectrum isn't linear, but it is viewed as such. To help put a stop to this view of the spectrum, I will attempt to describe an overview of the spectrum. There's disagreement on the importance of being affected by the policy, being directly affected by the policy, and sharing various group identities with those who are affected in deciding who gets to consent and agree. Feel free to watch these videos where I share my opinion on agent relativity and collectivism to know where I stand on this issue. There's disagreement on whether the magnitude of the membership condition affects how much of a say, or just if one has a say. On resolving disagreements, there is of course the simple majority rule where the choice with 50% plus one agreement wins. There's also plurality, supermajority, and consensus. Plurality just picks the choice with the highest amount of agreements. Supermajority refers to a process similar to majority but requiring greater percentage of agreement than 50, such as 75. Supermajority refers to a process similar to a majority but requiring greater percentage of agreement than 50%, such as 75%. Now, consensus refers to a more complex decision-making process, which strives for unanimous consent and agreement. It allows for near unanimity as well, but the important point is that anyone who wants their voice to be heard has their voice heard, and any objections that are raised are addressed openly. This method is time-consuming and tends to only work for groups that are small relative to how large the groups can be with the other methods. But there is still additional methods for deciding policy. This category of methods involves using multiple methods and then assigning priorities to different methods. One of the more powerful methods of both having a democracy and preserving the rights of the people against the bad types of populism is to give a supermajority's prior decisions a greater priority over a majority's decisions. This is the basic idea of having a malleable constitution. There's also the simple idea that if a policy hasn't been decided by whatever system decides policy, then property ownership and self-ownership decides who has the priority. Representatives are commonly accepted for the purposes of representing the views of the people who they are elected by, without taking up as much of the electorate's time. But there is a split in how representatives are viewed. Some people think that processes other than the wills of the electorate, such as a term limit or place of birth, should affect the ability of the electorate to elect a representative. By the same token, some people think that similar processes should affect the ability of the electorate to recall their representative's status of representation. I separate the two because despite how similar they appear to be, one of the two is much more justifiable than the other. There's also disagreement on how many representatives there should be to both adequately represent the people's views and not fall prey to corruption. I could go into further detail on specific ways people could misinterpret what I'm saying here, or I could keep listing areas of disagreements. However, I prefer to keep the video more direct than that, and less rambly. Also, I've been running into a bit of creative stupor whenever I attempt to expand on my thoughts here, and I think it'd be better for my process if I just shoved it out instead of continuing to worry about it. So having said that, I hope you have a nice day. And please call me an idiot in the comments section below.